Welcome. I don't know how long this video is going to be. It may be that I have to go across and tell this over several videos. I shall aim for about half an hour. The title will become self-explanatory, shall we say, as we go further into this. As much as anything else, it is an overview that is beyond this story that will help give you a grasp and an understanding about this reality. So we need to go way back and set the scene, as it were. So if we turn to the story of Enki, as is given. Enki is part Nanuna and part Draco. Draco on his mother's side. So you could say he's a hybrid. That is reflected in Star Trek. You have a character called Spock, and he is half human, half Klingon. And if any of you are familiar with the Star Trek stories, the Klingons are quite a warlike race, or whatever you want to call them. So we're now come forward with this. Now I want you to appreciate that time and stories are a series of loops. What also will come into this, amongst many other things such as numerology, is that there are soul families, there are repeat patterns of stories, and you'll often have families intertwine, and you'll go back into that same soul family, and there will be interactions with other families. It's a difficult thing to try and even put into words, but hopefully you get the gist from that. So we're going to give this story an historical setting, a starting point, shall we say. So we need to go back to Henry VIII of England, King of England. If I remember rightly, he died in 1538. We're using as a basis here, shall we call it wiki history. We could get into the rights and wrongs and the perceptions of whether he was the rightful king or not, but we just run with this story and with this timeline, as it were. So after the death of Henry VIII, his successor is his only son, Edward VI, who is quite sickly. If I remember rightly, he lives to the age of about 16 at most. And he nominates as his successor Lady Jane Grey, known as the 9 Days Queen. The number 9 is very significant in this, as is the number 5. So, going with the wiki history, Lady Jane Grey was born in 1537. Now the 5, let's just take that out of the equation. That leaves you with 137. Now, Archaics veterans and anybody familiar with what Jason shows on Archaics channel with the Phoenix events happens on the 138th year. That leaves a period of 137, 1, 3 and 7, which also makes 11, which also implies the number 4. The 4 is a door. So Born in 1537, and she becomes queen on the 10th of July 1553 and reigns for just 9 days until the 19th of July 1553. The significant part of that is the 10, which is a 1, and the 19. The 19 theme, I think you'll find, has been played out recently because history repeats. And she's actually confined initially to the Tower of London, and she's beheaded at the age of 17 on the 12th of February, which gives you a 212 or a 122, or make of this what you will, in 1554. She's only 17 years old. Incidentally, you may want to get yourself a cup of coffee. The visuals, I'm just appearing on screen, but it's irrelevant really. I am just the storyteller of this. And I'm deliberately saying these things at such a way that you can maybe put the playback speed to hear this on 1.25 or 1.5, and it will take up less of your time, but you'll still get the basic content. It's entirely up to you, or you can listen to it in sort of real time at normal speed, as it were, depending on what you put the settings on YouTube. So 1554 is a way of expressing 555, because this is to do with 5 senses. This is to do with internalizing 5 senses, and as much as anything else, it's in this 5 sense reality. So that's where the other 5 comes in, connected with the 137, which gives you the birth year of 1537. Now you may be wondering why this is entitled An Interview with a Vampire. What has that got to do with Lady Jane Grey? If you look at the basis of the story, now there's a particular Dracula film in recent years. It might be Johnny Depp is the actor, I really can't remember. I think it's actually called An Interview with a Vampire. I may be blurring 2 films here. But in that story, Dracule, or Count Dracula, is actually doing the work of what is really the Vatican, the Catholic Church. It is defending and supporting that, and basically the dirty is done on him, and he is so enraged, has such a feeling of betrayal, that effectively what you could say is the church creates a vampire, creates a monster that is intent on settling a score, and as part of that is fallen into the lower 3 chakras and takes on a kind of immortality, shall we say. So the part to take from that, because we're in a realm that is like duality, and as I've spoken about on previous videos, there's such a thing as the bounce back, how a story can become twisted. So we're not looking at a man, we're looking at a woman. It's a role played by a female. So if you can imagine the effect that this young queen loses her life at 17, and her life is cut off way before its time, as it were. It's an untimely death. So that feeling, that resentment, that betrayal would have a huge energy. In this reality, as Neville Goddard says, there is no loss, there is nothing added, there is nothing taken away. So that energy that's created, that was always there and has been there for a very, very long time, will just repeat and manifest in different forms. Now, why was Lady Jane Grey nominated as the successor to Edward VI? It's because she was very outspoken in letters about being very pro-Protestant, very against the Catholic Church. And obviously, as the story goes, Henry VIII is the founder of the Church of England. That was carried on by Edward VI, so he would in turn pass that on to one that would be as staunchly supportive of this Protestant Church of England movement. Now, consider also, this is a young girl of probably 16, maybe even 15, who is expressing her leanings to a particular way. Bear in mind, she would have been highly educated. She would have been taught and, shall we say, groomed into certain things with certain families of that standing in that social standing in the terms of material wealth. So she would have a lot of knowledge. She would have been trained in a lot of things. So when you look at the wiki article about why there was this gap from the 19th of February 1553, sorry, the 12th of February I'm getting that mixed up. From the 19th of July 1553 until her beheading on the 12th of February 1554. It's to do as much as anything else with the numerology, but as it says in that wiki article, her successor, which is Mary, who is a relative, a cousin, as it says in the article, Lady Jane Grey was seen as a threat. Now, it's very interpret to see that as being a threat to the country, to the nation. But in truth of it, it is a threat to the rival power. So that was the story with Lady Jane Grey. So look at Archaic's channel, look at the Chronicon, look at the chronology, and you'll see beyond any reasonable doubt that stories and history repeats over and over again. So the next time that Lady Grey comes back is around about the time of the Second World War, probably around 1944 to 1945, a time when stately homes were sort of commandeered by the military, the US military that came in. So when this story is replayed out The original Lady Jane Grey is the offspring of a Tudor, a two-door. So there's your twin pillars referenced in that, and a Dudley. Dudley, the word dud means nothing or dead. So when the story is played out again, the father is sort of taken out the equation, as it were, because he is an American serviceman. And there is a product of a union, of an affair with a very charismatic American serviceman and this Lady Grey. This produces a daughter. Now bear in mind, in certain families and even in at least one religion, there is a matriarch rather than a patriarch line, a lineage of blood. Also, what comes into this, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but your DNA for the physical body, you get 23 chromosomes from each parent, which gives you 46. Referenced in the Bible as Jesus says, I can tear down the temple that took 46 years to build and rebuild it in 3. But if you go back a previous generation to the grandparents, so you've got 4 that comes into this, the number 4 again. 2 grandfathers, 2 grandmothers. The split of what you inherit is not an even 25% split. Potentially you could have 97% that is in the blood from one grandparent and only 1% from the other 3. That's taking it at a sort of almost ultimate extreme of percentages of what is inherited in these physical bodies within the blood, which is a cellular memory that goes back over generations. There is such a thing as a Akashic record, which is a living library. It's to do with accessing that, to do with the going within oneself, going into the deep, going into the abyss, going into what could seem like the most abysmal. It's penetrating to the deepest, darkest depths, shall we say. And that also brings in that saying as within, so without. Well, what about as without, so within? Things work both ways. As above, so below is another one. But consider with that, just going off on a tangent, as above, so below. How do you hear and how do you perceive what you're considering as above and what you're considering as below? I would suggest that you consider an upper world and an underworld. And the earth is an earthing plane, a neutral playing field, the chessboard on which the black and white pieces play out the drama on a world stage, you could say. So we have this Lady Grey, born around, say, let's say 1944. Something feels right about that anyway. Okay, yeah. The Interview with a Vampire is such that, just like a vampire has no reflection in the mirror in the story, the interview was not where I would have liked it, sitting in one chair and actually talking to another person who I can ask questions. So I'm just relaying this from the guest. It's just a story after all. So now you have this Lady Grey, who is of a particular social standing, and she is half royal, half what would be seen from that perspective as lesser, just a commoner. But blood and everything held quite sacred for various reasons by certain families. Well, this Lady Grey repeats history, and in turn she too has an affair. And there is another product. This time it's not a daughter, it's alternated now. This time it comes out as a son. And we can also bring in the whole Osiris, Set, Horus trinity of, or the Cain and Abel story as much as anything else. The Fasolt and Fafnir, the two giants in the ring cycle, where you have, shall we say, a father who has a brother. It's also expressed in the Disney film Lion King. You have the lion and you have his brother who's not sort of heir to the throne. It's also retold in with King John and King Richard. King John sort of standing in on the throne of England while Richard the Lionheart is off on the Crusades. And of course it's that sort of portrayal in a lot of families of the wicked uncle. Now add on to this that you have a matriarch inheritance line. How insanely jealous that uncle would be if he knew there was a nephew that was now going to affect his inheritance. What extreme would that uncle go to? Possibly murder? So this next Lady Grey, who's only 25% bloodline and now has a 75% bloodline, so you could express that as a 12 if you add the 7 and the 5, the 75, which would leave the 25, which would be a 7. But you've got this 75-25 split. You have a trinity, and then you have a fourth part, which is a doorway, as much as anything else. I'm just trying to remember to relay this. Yeah. Okay. So this next Lady Jane Grey, she's about 25 years old, and the setting is a wealthy family with servants, a sort of another family line that always rubs shoulders with this particular family line throughout history. They would be sort of what will be called yeoman class, one down from the landed gentry, but very important if you think in terms of the lords whose income is from their land. So it's delegation. So you'd have your yeomen, you would have your taxes from the grinding of corn, the rental of properties on this land to the farmers and such like, and the villagers. So the yeoman would be quite well known to the gentry. And there's also the element of humiliation ritual. You have what is known as the privies. When you get to that sort of levels of kings and queens, they don't wipe their own arse, so you'd have somebody do it for you, very close to that king or queen, knowing the quite intimate parts, shall we say, of that king or queen or prince or princess. So they're quite well entrusted, and that is reflected in most recent years with Lady Diana Spencer, who comes from this lineage where there was a Lord of the Privies, if you go back far enough, but very closely interconnected with that particular royal family. So coming back to this Lady Grey again, knowing what her brother was like, again, the story repeats with being very well educated, also having this somewhere in that 75% DNA, a very strong-willed determination that you could almost compare to going back to Enki with the Anunnaki or the Anuna and doing the unthinkable. Because with Enki, he's not a full Anuna, he's half Draco, so there is a DNA sequence, and you'll notice with all these things the compatibility, as Jason said recently on Archaics about the fallen angels, their ability to mate with humans would show that they are not that different, at least in the biological makeup. So offspring can be created, hybrids can be created, and of course you'll also see, if you look at stories connected with these bloodlines and these families, that every 7 generations they have to bring what would be classed an outsider back in to correct the defects that would come about in the blood. This is also reflected in Earth when it talks about grow things for 6 years on that land and leave that 7th year as a year of rest. A bit like with the days of the week, the Sabbath, the 7th day is one of rest, going with that whole story. But I think you can appreciate the pattern to do with the 1 out of the 7. How are we doing for time here? Right, we're nearly up to 30 minutes. So there is a product of this union again, but this time it is a son. And this Lady Grey is very aware of what her brother is capable of and getting away with and covering up. And so it would come down to bringing in this sort of privy family that are privy to knowledge of certain things, and basically playing out the Moses story of not now putting Moses in a basket and floating him down the river, but placing that child, that son, into a family that rubs shoulders with that other family, with the Greys family, for example. There's no coincidences with names, because Lady Grey is alive today again, and even the surname reflects that with a colour, I shall say. I can't actually say that this story has no connection to people living past or present. That the start point of this story with Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, for example, is putting it into a historical context. But it is, after all, only a story. But as this progresses, I hope that you'll appreciate how numerology, how time loops, how parallel timelines and such like all come into this, how stories repeat with additional plot twists and things, So you have a story of the 9 Days Queen, who then reincarnates and then plays out the story. But then we move the story on to the next chapter, so there is another generation, and then we generate a new story that still repeats, but it's generating a new story with a new generation. So we've had a Lady Jane Grey who reincarnates as a Lady Grey, who has a daughter, because the first Lady Jane Grey never went on to have any successors because of her untimely death at the age of 17. So the next time round, she does have a daughter, who then, in turn, by the time we get to number 3, then the story flips and has a son, and then it plays out a bit of a Moses story. So we'll end at this point, because we've now hit 31 minutes, and we'll pick up the story and bring it up to date, as it were. Is it okay? Yeah. Okay, so we'll end that there. Make of this what you will. I hope you find this at least fascinating and intriguing. I'm just merely skimming over the sort of key points of the stories, because this would be exceptionally long if I took it all the way through, and it would go on to volumes and volumes. But the core part of it would then probably be lost in the details, and I really wish to just give you the key points so you can apply this to your perception of this reality and how you can reflect on this within your own lives, and you may see there are parallels and things. This may unlock things so you can find those parallels in your own personal lives, as it were. So I'm going to say love to you all until episode 2, which I will follow up within a day or two. Thank you very much, and thank you very much.